and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. The United States and South Korea's joint military exercises have ended, but North Korea is still not coming to the negotiating table and hurled an insult at Secretary Pompeo. South Korea, meanwhile, abandons an intelligence sharing agreement with Japan. How will the U.S. manage the latest developments?
We are prepared to engage as soon as we hear from our counterparts in North Korea.
정부는 한일 간 군사 비밀 정보 보호에 관한 협정 지소미아를 종료하기로 결정하였으며
In the studio with me today, Mr. Frank senior expert on North Korea at the United States Institute of Peace. Mr. Served as the senior advisor for North Korea in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
Thanks.
Scott, let me begin with you. So, Special Representative Biegun was in South Korea, but he failed to meet with his North Korean counterparts. Yet, Chairman Kim Jong-un wrote a letter to President Trump and said he would like to resume negotiations as soon as the joint military drills between U.S. and South Korea are over. So, why is North Korea keep on making promises and breaking them?
Well, I think that the North Koreans detect over-eagerness on the part of the United States to get back to talks. And they also see strategic weakness on the part of the U.S., especially in the context of rising tensions between Japan and South Korea. And so the North Koreans see dragging things out as to their advantage. But the other problem is that this sort of behavior reduces credibility of North Korea in the eyes of the U.S. and makes people more doubtful that Kim Jong-un will honor his verbal pledge to achieve complete denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. What is your take, Frank? Why is North Korea not coming back to the negotiating table? And is North Korea going back to its old playbook of dragging its feet and salami slicing?
Well, I think we have to recognize several things. One is that negotiations take time, and all the past agreements that we've had with North Korea, whether it's the agreed framework or the commitments in the six-party talks, it took many years to achieve those. And so remember that we are 1 year removed from the Singapore summit. Relatively speaking, that's not a whole lot of time that has passed, so it's going to take time. Second, we also have to recognize that North Korea also have their own complaints about broken promises. So they've been complaining for most of the year about President Trump sort of backtracking on the suspension of military exercises. They find the Dongmeng modification to be not Trump living up to his word. Also, they're very concerned about the F-35 stealth fighters that South Korea is taking possession of by the end of this year. They feel like that does not live up to the Panmunjom Declaration commitments and the idea of defusing military tensions on the peninsula. So I think it's still a bit early, right? The military exercise just ended this week, and also we're trying to figure out, how we're not getting back to exercise. I think we should wait a bit and see how things develop from here.
Mm-hmm. And Frank, regarding those assertions from North Korea that U.S. is not keeping its promises, Secretary Pompeo actually said that U.S. is doing exactly what President Trump promised to Chairman Kim, and nobody was in that room, right? And what do you make of North Korea hurling an insult at Secretary Pompeo at this time?
It's a little unclear because that insult was made by Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho, and it's a little bit uncommon for him to come out and make public statements like that. It could be just sort of posturing, particularly because Secretary has made comments about the need to maintain sanctions many times over the last several years. So I'm not exactly sure why Foreign Minister Ri is making this comment recently. Again, I think it's because of the potential for working level negotiations to proceed soon, and then trying to create some leverage there.
I think North Koreans have always been acutely sensitive to the environment surrounding negotiations. And it's pretty clear that Foreign Minister Ri perceived Secretary Pompeo's statement as evidence of inflexibility on the U.S. side. And really, if we dig under the surface, where the North Koreans want to go is to detente a normal relationship with the United States without denuclearization. And they want the sanctions lifting, even if they've reframed the discussion as about security guarantees. But what the U.S. wants is détente in exchange for denuclearization. And I think the North Koreans don't see a negotiation pathway yet to achieve détente that does not lead to North Korea having to take steps toward denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. And at this time when North Korea continues provocations and rhetoric, South Korea, Frank, canceled intelligence sharing agreement with Japan. And U.S. officials are very publicly criticizing South Korea for this move, expressing grave concerns and disappointment. What do you make of the level of disappointment?
Well, so the Defense Department expressed strong disappointment, and I think that's understandable. I served at the Defense Department between 2010 and 2017. I didn't work on the Jisomia directly, but I understand all the work that was required by all three sides to make this agreement happen after many years. The three countries share a threat from North Korea, and so this sort of move by South Korea is very hard to understand. It doesn't help in terms of security. It doesn't help in terms of the dispute between the two countries. I'm not sure what their calculus was. Obviously, they're trying to gain some political benefit, maybe even some leverage against Japan and the United States, but it's sort of a mind-boggling decision.
Mm-hmm. So was it purely a domestic decision, Scott?
Well, it looks like domestic factors influenced President Moon. And I think that is actually the core objection on the U.S. side, is I think there's an expectation, probably unstated, but broadly relevant, that foreign relations should be kept separate from domestic politics. And yet what we have seen in the South Korea-Japan relationship is the creeping politicization and domesticization of issues in Japan-South Korea relations, with the Jisomia non-renewal being the next step in that process. And so what the U.S., I think, is really saying is, no, please keep the Japan-South Korea relationship in a separate area and don't let domestic politics spill over into it. Otherwise, we're going to get nowhere.
Mm-hmm. And Scott, reportedly, U.S. officials are not only disappointed about the action itself, but the fact that South Korean officials publicly said that they have the U.S. understanding, and U.S. officials say that is totally not true. So do you think the latest South Korean decision may become a source of fissure between Washington and Seoul?
I think it already has become a source of fissure between Washington and Seoul. It basically means that perceptions of Japan are going to be an issue of difference on the agenda of the U.S.-South Korea alliance relationship. And as a result, that's a drag. It affects alliance cohesion, and it interferes with the ability of the alliance to focus on the external threats that we really need to be spending the majority of our time on.
Mm-hmm. And Frank, who stands to lose the most, U.S., South Korea, Japan, and what will be the impact on the military cooperation, the deterrence, and the U.S. regional strategy?
All three countries come out as losers. There's supposed to be a U.S. alliance, a U.S.-led alliance framework that's united against common threats, and this decision detracts from that common purpose. It doesn't help in terms of resolving the South Korea-Japan dispute. It doesn't help in terms of sharing military information. Now, let me say that two countries, South Korea and Japan, can continue to share military information, but it's going to be a little bit more cumbersome because now the U.S. has to act as an intermediary in terms of sharing the information, and it can't happen in real time. That being said, two countries can still share information. But again, all of this demonstrates and sends a message that this U.S.-led alliance framework in the region is falling apart. That's not the type of message we want to be sending to China, Russia, and North Korea.
Bottom line for the U.S. is that Japan and South Korea don't have to like each other, but they do have to live with each other. And we want them to live with each other in the context of a U.S.-led security architecture in East Asia.
And as Frank just mentioned, this signal of a demise of a U.S.-led security structure in the Northeast Asia, how would Russia and China take advantage of the latest situation?
Well, I think it's a gift to China. It really provides China with an opportunity to help widen the gap between Japan and South Korea. It's going to provide China with greater opportunities to put pressure on South Korea to try to cleave South Korea away from Japan and the United States and closer to China. Russia's already done an overflight of Tokdo, and so we see that as a problem. And North Korea could possibly have decided that it's okay to delay a little bit more in terms of coming back to the negotiating table because they can see that the U.S., Japan, and South Korea are in disarray.
There's been high-level engagement between North Korea and China and North Korea and Russia. And do you think North Korea is trying to muster more support from these two countries at a time when the nuclear talks are at a stalemate? And do you think this is the new road that North Korea has been warning about?
I think it's in North Korea's interest to pursue an omnidirectional diplomatic approach, and the North Koreans have always been looking for ways to balance and split off different parties against each other. But I don't see the North Koreans making really significant inroads in terms of restoring their relationship with China and Russia at the moment. It's true, I think maximum pressure has waned. And North Korea can take advantage of that. But I think that there still is a common broad interest in North Korea's denuclearization that should be able to hold China and Russia together in terms of at least rhetorical cooperation with the U.S.
And Frank, this week, Special Representative Biegun was in South Korea, and he told people that he will not take up the diplomatic post in Russia. And there were rumors that he would be the next U.S. ambassador to Russia. And why do you think Special Representative Biegun voluntarily dismissed this rumor?
Well, I think, first of all, this is the question on everyone's mind as we are on the precipice of returning back to working level negotiations. Hopefully, people are wondering whether he's going to stay on. So I think he wanted to get that question out of the way. He doesn't want to be a lame duck envoy that would diminish his leverage going into working level negotiations. So that makes sense. That being said, I do think that just because he's saying that right now doesn't mean that he's going to hold to that. He certainly has a Russia background. I think if he makes some progress and we eventually reach some sort of deal, whether even if it's an interim agreement, he can decide, okay, I've done my duty. You know, it's not a good position to be in on the working level talks on North Korea. It doesn't seem to respect the working level channel, and I want to move on. So it wouldn't surprise me if he decides to move on at the end of the year or early next year.
And what do you make of his performance so far as a lead negotiator with North Korea?
I think he's been fantastic. I think he's very well regarded by the Washington community. He's done very well with a very difficult position. But I think, again, he doesn't seem to have the full authority to make decisions. I think in any case, you know, it's the leaders who make the decisions. So North Korea recognizes that. And so I think they're going to try to diminish the working level channel as much as possible. Hopefully, after Hanoi, the leadership, both Chairman Kim and President Trump, will have be giving more authority to the working level negotiator, but that remains to be seen.
You know, there's one very interesting question in that regard, and that is the question of whether or not Special Representative Biegun should actually maybe have a higher position, maybe a role of envoy on behalf of the president. And really, I think that idea might be underscored by the rhetorical battles between Foreign Minister Lee Young-ho and his response to Secretary Pompeo's statements.
And before we go, Scott, so this latest incident over Jisomia, how can we recover from the damage caused?
Well, it's going to take time. I think the first thing is to stop creating further damage. And then really we need some kind of avenues for conversation, probably trilaterally, among the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. It's pretty clear that Japan and South Korea at this moment are having a lot of trouble talking to each other. I almost feel like the Japan-South Korea relationship is similar to Panmunjom, where there's only like a few telephone channels. And yet, Japan and South Korea, modern societies, there are a lot of potential avenues for communication, but they can't communicate with each other effectively right at this moment.
I do want to add that ultimately this is a bilateral issue, and the two countries need to resolve the issue together. At the same time, the U.S. has to play an important role here, even if it's just behind the scenes. They played an important role to get the two countries together in terms of the 65 Normalization Treaty. They played an important role to get the two countries to agree to the Comfort Women Resolution in 2015. They need to play an important role here as well.
So, in recent months, National Security Advisor Bolton and Assistant Secretary Stilwell and also the Defense Secretary traveled to the region and told South Korea to, refrain from withdrawing from Jisomia. So, do you think there's more the U.S. should do?
Clearly, there's more that needs to be done because we're seeing that it hasn't been helpful so far, and it's very disturbing when you have a trilateral meeting in Beijing where China is almost, at least in terms of perception, looking like they're getting the two sides together. That doesn't look good for the United States. Again, there's probably a lot more that's going on behind closed doors, but in terms of public perception, it seems like there's more that can be done.
And Frank is putting his finger on a critical point, and that is that there are signs that our allies are not listening to the U.S. behind the scenes. And that may be the most disturbing aspect of the current dispute.
Well, we'll leave it here and watch video for our next discussion.
As it relates to North Korea, we obviously issue travel warnings for American citizens.
We fully hope that it will be possible when we go through the process to be allowed to come back.
The State Department extended a ban on American travels to North Korea for another year. The ban was first introduced 2 years ago, following the death of American college student Otto Warmbier, who had been detained in North Korea. Now, Frank, Washington sends out signals that it wants talks with North Korea, yet what should we make of the latest travel ban extension? Is this another way of putting pressure on North Korea?
Yeah, so I think it's a bit contradictory if you're saying that you want to have better relations with North Korea, but then you're continuing to impose the travel ban. That being said, I think there's a couple of reasons for the imposition and the extension of the travel. One is that there seems to be an escalation in terms of detention of U.S. citizens by North Korea, and so that's problematic from not only a humanitarian standpoint, but also political, as well as in terms of negotiations. And then second, if we're trying to maintain pressure on North Korea, we want to ensure that we clamp down on the funds that North Korea receives through U.S. tourists and travelers. So I understand from that standpoint why we want to continue the travel ban.
And the travel ban was first introduced 2 years ago. How do you think the travel ban has hurt the North Korean economy?
Well, it probably hasn't hurt the North Korean economy that much. I really think that it is more of a self-protective measure related to U.S. citizens. From a political perspective, President Trump was able to get hostages back. He doesn't want North Korea to take more hostages. And I think it also really underscores the political impact of the death of Otto Warmbier and its long-lasting effects on the U.S.-North Korea relationship.
And we're talking about these political effects, both of you mentioned. So how has the 16 Americans who were detained in North Korea the past decade, how has that impacted the nuclear negotiations?
Well, I think first we have to recognize that we have a small sample size, right? So there's been instances where there have been U.S. detainees in North Korea with no nuclear negotiations, but there's also been times where we've been trying to get back to talks with North Korea, and having U.S. citizens detained in North Korea has complicated the situation. So, for example, in early 2009, the two U.S. journalists, Eun-ai Lee and Laura Ling, were detained by North Korea, and we had to send former President Clinton there to negotiate their release. That complicated our efforts to get back to six-party talks. And also in the current situation where North Korea released the 3 Korean-American citizens leading up to the Singapore summit, maybe North Korea decided that there was some leverage there in doing so it can complicate the situation.
And China, when we talk about international travels to North Korea, more than 90% are Chinese travelers. And Japanese media reports that after Xi Jinping's visit to North Korea, he made orders to the Chinese travel agencies to beef up the number of Chinese travelers to 5 million people. So what has been the linkage between the Chinese travelers and the relations between Beijing and Pyongyang?
Well, this has become China's main means of providing indirect budget support to North Korea. Tourism to North Korea is not banned under UN Security Council resolutions. Chinese tourists are bringing cash to North Korea, and so it helps North Korea's economy, and it's probably the most effective way of doing so given the other bans that have been imposed on the North Korean economy under UN Security Council resolutions.
So Frank, the United States protects freedom as a constitutional right, and North Korea is the only country that currently the United States bans its people from going. So does that show how much U.S. is concerned about travels to North Korea?
It does, but I think it's a very difficult situation because the U.S. government's position has always been we try to separate humanitarian issues and from the political issues, but in practice that's hardly ever the case, right? And so not just in terms of the travel ban, but also things like the remains recovery operations and other provision of humanitarian assistance. It's difficult to disentangle those two because oftentimes one provides leverage for the other.
So the current Trump administration, where's the emphasis, do you think? The humanitarian aid or pressure on North Korea?
Well, it's primarily on ensuring maximum pressure. That was certainly the case in 2017 when that policy was adopted. But there have been NGOs that have been complaining about how that has impacted their ability to provide aid and get OFAC licenses and travel to North Korea. So we've seen the State Department step back a little bit and lighten up on that earlier this year. And so now more NGOs are going into North Korea. But I think, again, the predominant position right now is to maintain pressure.
So Scott, how do you think the Trump administration is striking a balance between the humanitarian aid and maintaining pressure on North Korea?
Well, there's no balance. It's really all focused on maximum pressure. And in fact, I think that the environment for humanitarian exchange with North Korea is the worst that it has been since the U.S. and North Korea started talking with each other diplomatically. And so it really shows that the focus on sanctions is spilling over and impinging into a space that has traditionally been kind of protected from politics. And the North Koreans have noticed that. They've responded to it to some degree. And I think they're watching that actually as a litmus test for the U.S. position. But we also see many other levers by which the Trump administration is ratcheting up sanctions pressure. And it doesn't necessarily have to impinge on the humanitarian space. And so that's the adjustment that I think Frank was talking about earlier. It's a tough situation. And I think that the U.S. is essentially prioritizing political leverage over humanitarian exchange at this time.
Well, we'll leave our conversation here and now move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today, it's actually a tragic photo, a vigil for a North Korean defector in her 40s and her 6-year-old son, who were found dead earlier this month. The two are believed to have starved to death, sending shockwaves throughout the country. Seoul's Unification Ministry said it would review the support system for North Korean defectors. Scott?
It's such a heartrending story, and I think that it does highlight the fact that in South Korea, there needs to be constant attention and support for defectors. Not enough has been done, I think, generally. And I think that the story really exposed some gaps with regard to the staffing and administration of support systems that defectors should be able to rely on.
Frank?
I agree with Scott. It's a very sad situation, and it's not isolated. I'm sure there's many other situations where, North Korean defectors, after coming over, they get a certain stipend, some support for a certain amount of time, but after that, they basically fall through the cracks. And not only that, there's a lot of discrimination against the North Korean defectors. So I agree, there needs to be a lot more support that's provided over a long-term sustainable period.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Scott, Frank, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eunjung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.